Good morning, dear children. So, today we shall start our next poetry, that is After Blenheim by Robert Southey. So, let's begin with the introduction of the poet and little bit about the poetry, which will help you to understand the poem in much better way. It's very easy, very simple, and very interesting, children. Okay. So, Robert Southey, you may take your page number 16 in your textbook. Robert Southey was an English romantic poet. He was the poet laureate of his time. He wrote this poem in 1796 about a battle that took place in Blenheim, a village in southern Germany in 1704. Okay, so it's very important, children, in this to know that this the poet wrote this poem in the year 1796. Okay, and about what he wrote the poem? He wrote the poem about a battle that took place in Blenheim, a village in southern Germany in 1704. That is, in southern Germany, there was a village in the year 1704, and the name of the village is Blenheim, and the poet has written about the war that took place on the land of Blenheim. It is an anti-war poem that sharply criticizes the destruction and death caused by war. The poet uses the simple narrative of a grandfather explaining to his two grandchildren his own sufferings and the suffering of many others like him who were victims of the battle. So, it is an anti-war poem. Anti-war poem means that is the poem that completely opposes the war. Okay, the poem that is not in favor of the war. So it is an anti-war poem that sharply criticizes the destruction and death caused by war. That is, whenever war take place and in that so much of destruction and death take place, so this war completely sarcastically criticizes the war. So the poet uses the simple narrative of a grandfather explaining to his two grandchildren his own suffering and the suffering of many others like him who were victims of the battle. So the poet in this, Robert Southey, the poet uses a simple narrative, that is, in order to explain us about the war and its destruction and the death that was caused during the war. So he has used a very simple language in a very simple narrative way. He has used the characters, a grandfather is there and his two grandchildren are there. So grandfather is explaining to his grandchildren his own suffering, that is, he himself was the victim of the war. मतलब जो grandfather था वो खुद ही इस war में सफ़र किया था और वो अपने बच्चों को बता रहा है. ही इज़ एक्सप्लेनिंग टू हिज टू ग्रैंड चिल्ड्रन अबाउट हिज ओन सफरिंग, कि मतलब कि उसने क्या क्या चीज़ें सफ़र की थी, एंड द सफरिंग ऑफ मैनी अदर लाइक हिम हु वर विक्टिम्स ऑफ द बैटल. एंड ग्रैंडफादर ऑल्सो टेल्स अबाउट द सफरिंग ऑफ मैनी अदर पीपल दोज हु हैड बिकम द विक्टिम ऑफ द बैटल. मतलब जिन्होंने बैटल में सफ़र किया था तो उनके बारे में और ख़ुद के बारे में बताया. देन द ग्रैंडफादर cannot give any good reason for war and can only repeat that it was a famous victory. So when grandfather was explaining to his children about the sufferings, his own suffering and about the suffering of the others, then his grandchildren asked to him what is the reason behind the battle, that is why this such a battle took place, what is the reason behind that. But grandfather was speechless and he couldn't give any good reason for war. वो कुछ बोल ही नहीं सका कि exactly reason था क्या, and can only repeat that it was a famous victory. और सिर्फ उसने क्या बोला, क्या बताया अपने बच्चों को, that it was a famous victory. Obviously, this was the propaganda that was indoctrinated in the common people, and it was very obvious, ये बहुत ही common सी बात थी, that during the war, when this war was won, then it was the only propaganda, this was the propaganda that was indoctrinated in the common people, कि common people में जो आम जनता थी उनके बीच में सिर्फ यही बोला गया that it was a famous victory. Okay, that is, ये नहीं बताया गया कि इसमें कितना ज़्यादा नुकसान हुआ, that so much of destruction was there, that so many people lost their lives. So that was not told to the common men, only it was told that it was a famous victory. And the poet wants to emphasize through the repetition of the lines that wars are senseless, futile and evil, and that in war there are no real winners. Okay, now in this poem, again and again when you will read, then you will see again and again the line is repeated that it was a famous victory. So why this line is repeated so many times? So the poet wants to emphasize through the repetition of the lines that wars are senseless. मतलब कि जो पोएट है वो ये एम्फेसाइज करना चाह रहा है, वो इस चीज़ पे दबाव डालना चाह रहा है इस लाइन के रिपीट होने से, दैट द वॉर्स आर सेंसलेस, futile and evil, and that in war there are no real winners. Okay, he exactly wants to emphasize only at this point that whenever battles take place between the two countries, whenever wars takes place between the two countries, so these wars are of no use. Okay, these are senseless, futile and evil, and that in war there are no real winners. This is a powerful poem that echoes Wilfred Owen's famous quote, "The pity of war." This poem is a wake-up call to seek peaceful solutions to all conflicts. मतलब कि this is a powerful poem, that this poem after Blenheim is very powerful, and it speaks of the Wilfred Owen's famous quote, and that is the pity of the war, that whenever the war take place, so much of the destruction takes place that common men have to suffer. So this poem is a wake-up call, that is, this poem is a wake-up call for every one of us to seek peaceful solutions to all the conflicts. That is, this tells us, this teaches us, it gives us moral that wars are useless and we should never go for battles and war. We should always go for the peaceful solutions to all the conflicts, that whenever such kind of conflicts take place between the two countries or between the two parties, then never we should go for the war or the fights, because they are of no use and it doesn't benefit to anyone. Okay, so this is about the poet and about the poem children. Now let me read out the poem and then we shall have the explanation. After Blenheim by Robert Southey. It was a summer evening. Old Caspar's work was done, and he before his cottage door was sitting in the sun, and by him sported on the green his little grandchild Wilhelmine. She saw her brother Peterkin roll something large and round, which he beside the rivulet in playing there had found. He came to ask what he had found that was so large and smooth and round. Old Caspar took it from the boy, who stood expectant by, and then the old man shook his head, and with a natural sigh, "'Tis some poor fellow's skull," said he, "who fell in the great victory. I find them in the garden, for there's many here about, and often when I go to plough, the ploughshare turns them out. For many thousand men," said he, "were slain in that great victory. Now tell us what it was all about, young Peterkin," he cries, and little Wilhelmine looks up with wonder-waiting eyes. "Now tell us all about the war, and what they fought each other for." "It was the English," Caspar cried, "who put the French to rout, but what they fought each other for I could not well make out. But everybody said," quoth he, "that it was a famous victory. My father lived at Blenheim then, yon little stream hard by. They burnt his dwelling to the ground, and he was forced to fly. So with his wife and child he fled, nor had he where to rest his head. With fire and sword the country round was wasted far and wide, and many a childing mother then and newborn baby died. But things like that, must be at every famous victory. They say it was a shocking sight after the field was won, for many thousand bodies here lay rotting in the sun. But things like that, must be after a famous victory. Great praise the Duke of Marlborough won, and our good Prince Eugene. Why, it was a very wicked thing, said little Wilhelmine. Nay, nay, my little girl, quoth he, it was a famous victory. And everybody praised the Duke, who this great fight did win. But what good came of it at last, quoth little Peterkin. Why, that I cannot tell, said he, but it was a famous victory. So, children, we have read the poetry, and in this there are three main characters. One is grandfather, whose name is Casper, and his two grandchildren are there. Granddaughter's name is Wilhelmine, and grandson name is Peterkin. Okay, and grandfather, that is old Casper, is narrating to his grandchildren about the war that took place long back in the year 1796. Okay, fine. Now we shall have the further explanation, complete explanation in the next period. Till then, you take out your workbook and read out once the explanation that is given.